Hi everyone, this video is going to be about the week 1 assignment. So in this assignment, you're supposed to summarize O'Loughlin's argument in 2 to 3 pages. And the article can be found under the resources tab in the class. So if you go to week 1 resources, you can find the article right here. If you click on it, you'll be taken immediately to the article itself, where you'll be able to download the article. So click download PDF, accept the download. Remember that in this class, you have to have a computer to complete these assignments. So if you're trying to do this on your phone, you're not gonna be very successful. Also, a computer works better in terms of getting to the article in the library. Okay, so here we have it. This is O'Loughlin's article. So this is the only thing you need for this assignment. I've noticed that students are going to other sources. They're talking about things in general. It looks like they're using sources that aren't related to O'Loughlin's article. The only thing you need to complete this assignment is the O'Loughlin article. So you're supposed to summarize O'Loughlin's argument. And then in what ways did Stowe reflect her culture? In what ways did she influence it? In what ways did Uncle Tom's Cabin positively influence American culture? And in what ways did it negatively influence? So that all comes out of the article itself. So you should be focusing on the positive and negative things that O'Loughlin's talking about in the article, not external sources about Harriet Beecher Stowe in general. Okay, so let's start. So there's an introduction here where O'Loughlin talks a little bit about some of the influences that that Stowe's article had on people, specifically Henry James. And so this is a good place to start thinking about some of the influences. All right, so on page 574, we have this area. So remember, in an article, the author will usually state the thesis early on. So you need to be looking for the thesis on the front end. So the significance of the popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin comes from the coordinating role, to use a term from 2 other academics, this text played in American culture. So he's saying it's popular because it coordinated things. I will argue, okay, so here we go. This could be the thesis. And this, O'Loughlin kind of spreads the thesis out on this page and the next. I will argue that as a popular text, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in a variety of forms, acted as a public site within which changing concerns about race, gender, class, and issues of nationhood were brought together and linked, or to be more precise, coordinated. In its maintenance and transgression of racial categories, its representations of femininity and feminism, its coded discourses of class, and its intersections with nationalism, Uncle Tom's Cabin served as both barometer and agent of cultural change for almost 100 years. Okay, so this is really long, but this is essentially the thesis. So what is O'Loughlin saying that he's going to argue? Well, he's going to say that as a popular text in a variety of forms. So O'Loughlin talks about in the article later on, and you know, I've graded a few papers now, and only one student has mentioned this from the article, that O'Loughlin talks about after the book was published, people started making plays with the characters from the book. So like shortened, condensed versions of, you could go see Uncle Tom's Cabin in the theater. And so that's what he means by multiple forms. Not only was it a book, but it was also enacted in plays. It was enacted like in road shows. It was mentioned. They made another thing that comes out in this article is they made a doll. So there were actual artifacts created in society that were given to little girls and boys, but in this case, the doll, the Topsy Ava doll. And if you don't know what that means, then you need to read the article. But the Topsy Ava doll was created. So that's another thing that you can mention in your paper, because you're supposed to be talking about the positive and negative effects. Okay, so, but what he's saying here is that the book did all of these things, okay? So it transgressed racial categories, it represented femininity, and many of you have mentioned that this week in the discussion. It's had coded discourses of class. Some of you have mentioned that, how people are represented differently. And it intersected with nationalism. Okay. All right, so let's see here. If we keep going down, here are some other things that O'Loughlin's going to do. 2 examples are given. Close consideration. These are the examples that you should use to talk about the positive and negative impacts in relation to this article. Don't go to Wikipedia or another source and find general comments. Only focus on this article. First, the history of the Topsy figure. Okay? So Topsy was a character from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So O'Loughlin's going to talk about the history of the Topsy figure and a pro-slavery novel called Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, which was written in response to Stowe's book. Finally, I take up Stowe's use of iconography to account for the particular manner in which aspects of her novel became part of pop culture. Okay, so those 2 examples, and again, I'm yet to see a paper where a student has explained those 2 examples as positive and or negative in relation to the prompt. So if you didn't do that and you want to revise, feel free. Or if this becomes the first video that I post about this assignment, then you need to revise, but you'll know that you should do that from the get-go. All right, so the state of popularity. An interesting passage down here is, so here O'Loughlin is talking about 2 academics who've studied this, and they disagree on the implications of things. So for Tompkins, the sentimental novel represents the interests of middle-class women against a male establishment, while for Broadhead, novel reading becomes a disciplinary technology in service of the new middle class. This particular disagreement should not obscure the similarities of their inherent claim that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a popular text because of its rhetorical ability to reflect back to the middle class their values and preoccupations. So here, O'Loughlin is attacking, not attacking, but he is getting into discourse with 2 other academics. Essentially, they're saying that the reason why Uncle Tom's Cabin was so popular was because it connected with middle-class values, and in one case, one of the researchers claims that it connected in particular with female middle-class values. Now, if you just stop there and you don't read the full article, you wouldn't see the next part, which says that there are 2 problems with this interpretation. So here, O'Loughlin is going to show the problems with that interpretation. And O'Loughlin does, in fact, claim that it didn't just connect to the middle class, and it wasn't just a representation of their values, but that it extended across multiple classes, and that's why it had such a wide circulation in readership. All right, so you might be saying, what are you doing, Justin? What are we doing right now? And what we're doing is we're going through this text because I'm trying to show you how to approach these things. You can't write a synopsis of an article if you don't read it. And it's important that you read things closely in order to understand them. Already, I know this video is getting pretty long, but I mean, that's what it takes, right? And it would take even longer if I could go through line by line, which I want to do, but I think people just wouldn't watch it. And by the way, if you continue to watch this video, I will get to some examples that you should include in your paper. Okay, so O'Loughlin continues on here on page 577 and starts talking about a modernist critique of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Obviously, one thing you know, that the modernists critiqued it. It was like this sentimental book. It wasn't a real representation of what the slaves were going through. It still fell into the same racism that it was attempting to critique, because it existed in the realm where Black people were still considered to be inferior and all of these things. So, you know, Stowe never really talks about that or pure equality or anything like that. And O'Loughlin replies to these critiques. Now, is this absolutely necessary for your synopsis? Probably not. That portion could be a minimal part. But this is his concept of articulation. And again, in all the papers I've graded, I've only had one student talk about this. So my question for you, I'm not going to explain it, is how does articulation function for O'Loughlin in this article? And there are a lot of key words here. Here there's a definition of articulation as it was initially presented. And here, right, I mean, it couldn't be more clear in relation to O'Loughlin's argument. Articulation describes the means by which cultural elements can be joined together. So if you haven't talked about articulation, that's extremely important because he's going to use that as a leveraging tool in order to continue his argument. Okay. So on 579, we get the first concrete example that O'Loughlin wants to talk about this articulation and also about the positive and negative ways that people appropriated Stowe's text. And it appears here. Topsy. Topsy is a character that appears midway through the novel. So we didn't make it that far in our reading. But still, O'Loughlin does a good job here of explaining who Topsy is and why she's important to the novel. So this is a child of slavery. She has no parents, and she is bought in order to test methods that Miss Ophelia has for educational and anti-slavery theories. So they're basically going to attempt to rehabilitate this child. And so O'Loughlin continues to talk about Topsy and the relationship to the story. You must include this example. This is the primary example in the article. O'Loughlin spends the next 4 or 5 pages of the article talking about this. So he explains then a relationship that Topsy has with a white girl named Ava. And Ava essentially is the saving grace of Topsy in this book, which, again, in the modernist critique or the more contemporary critique, of course, the white little girl has to save the black little wild child. So here, this is on page 581, the wild child motif emerges, and Topsy is a representation of this wild child, which was a manifestation at that time of what white people were afraid of in terms of black children, slave children. They were afraid of these little kids who were separated from their parents, who had no guidance, who would end up basically, potentially attacking them or being wild and then causing problems for them on their plantations and other things. O'Loughlin also talks about how this character changes over time. So what starts out as a character that is a serious character in the book who develops this relationship ends up becoming, and then this is on page 582, ends up becoming like the buffoon in adaptations of the book to plays that were performed. So, and then here there was a song that's called "I's Not So Wicked as I Used to Was," and they used that line to create a song. And so as these adaptations, as the plays would go out and people would do and put on these plays, Topsy became one of the most beloved characters in the play. But what they did is they mocked her, and they made her the buffoon. You know, every single Shakespearean play has the buffoon character, right? The minstrel they mention here, but you know, the comic relief. They come out and they're like, oh, hey, you know, they make fun of the king or whatever. And many plays have that buffoon character. Think about movies, right? So in movies, they have the Stifler character, right? The character that's just like, usually now it's kind of a man, and he's just an idiot, and he doesn't know what's going on, and people have to explain everything to him. It's a common trope. And in fact, I mean, some people argue that you have to have that character if you actually want to make something great. Okay, but I'm going to stop here in a minute, but if you didn't read this far, you didn't get to this point of the Topsy character. And so he continues to talk about how Topsy, the character of Topsy, developed over time. And then he talks about how Topsy went from a more serious type of relationship with this white girl to becoming the buffoon, to becoming this like thing that's made fun of, everybody laughs and stuff. So here you can see in this one image, and this was an advertisement for a poem that was written about Topsy, but you can see that she's standing, you know, more like a proper girl. Her hair is like, you know, she's wearing a nice dress and everything. And then over time, as they began to keep doing these shows, you can see that the Topsy character in this advertisement, this is for a play, is, you know, she kind of, you know, her hair's like all messed up. She's wearing like torn rags, essentially, a torn dress. She's like dancing around with a banjo. And it says, "Golly eyes so wicked." So what we learn here from the Topsy character is that as they were doing these plays and moving out west and making these performances, the people only connected to the Topsy character not as this poor little girl who was totally devastated by slavery, her parents taken away, didn't know her parents, lost, no love, and things like that. No, they connected with this caricature of this buffoon who made them laugh. And why did this person make them laugh? Because of their own inherent racist bias against these people. So the only thing that Topsy could be is this like comedic character, and that's why people connected to it. So what does that mean for us, though? Well, it might mean that during that time, you know, people still didn't really understand the negative aspects of racism and of the slave trade, and they still could only connect to this character by making her an idiot, for lack of a better term. And this is all, like, O'Loughlin, you know, talks about all of this. Okay, the video has gone on long enough if you made it this far. Here's another example where in the play they had two Topsy characters for extra enjoyment, for extra fun. Here's the example of the Topsy Ava doll. You can see that if you flipped it over and flipped the dress, one side was Topsy, one was Ava. O'Loughlin talks about this advertisement. Then he talks about a scene in a book by Toni Morrison called The Bluest Eye. It might be a short story, I'm not sure. But apparently Shirley Temple portrayed Ava in a different movie, and of course there were racial overtones, to say it lightly. And Toni Morrison talks about cutting apart a Shirley Temple doll, a Shirley Temple Ava doll, because of her hatred and things like that. So, okay. But then we get to the next example, which, again, I've had no students mention this example, which to me makes me think that people didn't read. So, you know, to be successful, you have to read the whole thing, and to summarize an article, you have to read the whole thing. So, the next thing, and I'm going to leave the video at this because I want people to do this part on their own, is there was a whole smattering of literature that emerged after Uncle Tom's Cabin that was pro-slavery and attempted to rewrite these stories from the perspective, from a basically racist pro-slavery perspective. And so what they were saying was that Tom is actually not a real character. There's no good black slave. They're all alcoholics, or they all beat their wives, or things like this. And this is precisely what O'Loughlin talks about. So the other thing, the way that Stowe's book influenced culture, was that it made a bunch of people say like, hey, I'm going to write a book too, because I totally disagree with what they're saying and they're wrong. And that was a representation of the other part of our culture. So that's the second example here that O'Loughlin uses. And then at the end of the article, O'Loughlin, as mentioned before, talks about iconography and wraps it all up, I think, in a very interesting way. And I'm not going to mention anything like that. I would like for you all to get there on your own and talk about how all of this fits together through his concept of articulation. I know this is a long video, but I hope that it helps to think about how to approach these articles, because we're going to be reading more articles like this in this class. So don't settle for generic comments or other resources. Totally focus on this article, do the best that you can, and write out as much detail about the article as possible. So I've given you one example that you should use. Positive and negative is the Topsy figure, but you need to talk about what O'Loughlin says about it. And then the second example is the backlash in literature. That's another example. All right, I hope you found this video useful, and I'll make more like this in the future to help guide you so that you can learn as much as possible, but also be in alignment with the expectations for the prompts.